unfortunately.
Is Fight Pass just not working?
It has worked for me. I actually just watched a fight on it.
I keep getting a connection error every time I try to watch a video. How it goes to connect and then...
Yeah, is it the same video that you're trying, or is it like oftentimes...
No, I've tried like 4 different videos.
Oh, that's weird. Let me try again.
Still, this fucking connection error.
My Google Chrome says it needs to update, and I haven't done it yet. Maybe like an update messed it up?
I tried it in Safari, too.
Oh.
And it didn't work. Okay.
Where is actually, like... God damn it. Cat.
Oh, that just signed me out of all my Google stuff, and I don't remember my fucking password.
Jesus Christ.
Fuck. God damn it. Oh, sorry, dude. Here, give me a second.
You're okay. You're okay. No rush.
Jesus. Aha. I'm back into my Gmail, at least.
All right.
Let's see.
Wasn't too bad. Since like the UFC contracted like, I don't know, Dana's second cousin on his wife's side to do the design. Clearly, like some ropey fucking company that no one's ever heard of did their video service.
Oh yeah, this is just some dog shit. Okay, now it's just logged me back out of this.
Jesus Christ.
Oh my God.
Hello and welcome to Heavy Hands. I am your host, Connor Ruebusch. With me, as always, is Dr. Patrick Wyman. And today we are going to be covering the upcoming UFC Orlando, aka UFC Emmett versus Stevens, one of the least inspiring main events the UFC has ever managed to put together for a Fox card. It's almost as if they looked back at Jacare versus Brunson 2 and thought, you know what? Hold my beer, bitch. So we are going to be talking about that on today's show, the main event there, as well as a couple of other fights from the undercard that pique our interests. In addition, a little bit later on, we will be looking back at last week's card. That was UFC Austin, with the main event between Donald Cerrone and Yancy Medeiros. Turned out to be a particularly entertaining night of fights. A lot of early finishes, especially on the prelims. Earlier in the night, it was just full of action, but... let's go ahead. I know we're both extremely excited about this event, Pat. Let's go ahead and get into Emmett versus Stevens. Overall take on the main event of UFC Orlando.
Whew. Well, okay, so I have to preface this by saying thanks to the unbelievable shittiness of UFC Fight Pass, I have not been able to watch nearly as much tape as I usually would for this, because it keeps saying connection error every time I try to watch a fucking video. So thanks for taking my money every month, you giant sack of shit thing. It's like, it's such an incredible metaphor for the UFC.
It is, isn't it?
They have a monopoly on this particular product, and they just can decide they're going to run shit out there because what else are you going to do?
Yeah.
Don't fucking watch it, you goof.
Yeah.
Like,
the UFC, the cable company of combat sports. Just love it.
Yeah, it's the Comcast of our lives.
The Comcast Sports.
But anyway, at least I was able to watch some. I was able to watch enough. I think this is probably Stevens' fight to lose. I think he has more kind of tools in the bag to draw on. I think he has a deeper well of skill on the feet as a striker. Emmett is very much a one-speed kind of guy, and while he's fast and powerful and knows how to throw in combination, which I think is a supremely underrated skill for a guy who wants to play the kind of game he wants to play, and is willing and able to hang in there and throw, I think Stevens just has way, way more depth to his game. I think he can play with more ranges. I think he can play with different kinds of tools. I think he can mix up his strikes. I think he's I think his ability to chop the legs and just play a kind of a consistent, not super high volume, but reliable point scoring game against a kind of a limited opponent should be enough for him to pull it out. And he's a good enough wrestler to keep it standing.
Yeah, but well, let's sort of set the stage for why Josh Emmett is here. and get an idea, a little technical retrospective to get an idea of what his game is. Because truth be told, there are probably many people, even perhaps people listening to this show, even though this tends to be, you know, one of those refuges of the mythical hardcore fans. But there are probably a lot of people who don't really know what Josh Emmett's game looks like, because he's here based on a huge upset in a fight that didn't really have any particular reason for being made, in which he missed weight to fight Ricardo Lamas in his UFC, not his featherweight debut, but his second featherweight bout, and got a big knockout out of nowhere. One speed, I think, is a very good descriptor for Josh Emmett. It's something that really, really stands out, is that he's not a slow fighter. He's actually pretty quick, especially with his hands, but he does seem like the kind of fighter that people tend to adjust to down the stretch. And we see that with a lot of fighters who really shock people with their speed, you know, like we see it with Tyron Woodley. We see it with, who else? I was talking about this with someone very recently, actually. I had a name on the tip of my tongue, and now I've lost it. We see the opposite of it with Yoel Romero, somebody who does a great job of hiding his speed and keeping it reserved so that it remains surprising throughout the bout. Josh Emmett, I don't think, has any idea how to do that. And it's difficult for him down the stretch with a lot of opponents, at least it has been thus far in the UFC, because once he's so willing to throw so many punches, because he does throw combinations, as you pointed out, Pat. He's so willing to let 3 or 4 or 5 punches go in a row. It's like people get a lot of opportunities to get his timing early. And while it makes him very dangerous to throw that much, the fact that he can't really vary the way, the rhythm, the tempo of his hands, or disguise that tempo with the tempo of his body movement, it makes it so that you kind of just get an idea of what he's doing by about halfway through the second round. Does that sound about right to you?
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to like about Emmett's game, but there is not a whole lot of a switch up. He doesn't, like, his switch up is, you know, sometimes he wrestles.
Sometimes he wrestles.
Yeah, I mean, which is not a bad switch up to have.
Sure.
But, like, that's kind of his fallback thing is, okay, if they're starting to get the hang of me on the feet, then I'll go and I'll shoot a takedown or two. And I'll go back and forth between takedowns and hands, and maybe that should be enough to keep them kind of confused. That's enough. You know, you look at his record, his only loss is to Desmond Green, who's a fine fighter in what was a pretty close fight.
Yeah. A very Desmond Green type of fight.
A very Desmond Green type of fight.
Yes.
But so Emmett does not have a lot of different kinds of options. He's still fairly young in the sport. I think he's like 5.5, 6 years into his career.
Yeah, he's 32, but he has only really been fighting in earnest since 2013.
Yeah, so he's got a lot. He's still growing quite a bit, and you can see he has made substantial improvements. Like, he's much more willing to throw in combination. He's got a much better. He's got a much quicker trigger, I think, than he did in his early UFC fights. He's a fine, solid kind of, I think, fringe top 15 featherweight. I think Jeremy Stephens is better than that at this point in his career.
Yeah. The combination punching is another thing to highlight. Like, that was the difference in the fight with Ricardo Lamas. Basically, in that finishing exchange, you saw the difference between a fighter who throws one shot and then decides to throw a combination, and a fighter who throws his first shot knowing he's going to throw a combination. Emmett being ready to pull the trigger while Lamas is sort of out of position, letting his guard down and leaving his chin out there as he kind of decides he wants to throw the left hook at the moment that Emmett has already launched it and it's halfway to the target. Stephens with the variation. Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because Jeremy Stephens sometimes has more variation than it seems like he wants to have. He doesn't exactly always show up in peak form. In fact, I would even say, like, in his last fight with Duha Choi, he wasn't in peak form at the start and then kind of woke himself up. Which maybe that was the difference between that performance and the Renato Moicano fight, where Stephens looked so flat. It's just that Moicano never hit Stephens enough to force him to, fight at his best. Whereas against Duha Choi, he had little choice. But Emmett does seem like exactly the kind of opponent to hit Stephens a few times early to be willing to trade with him. And I think that is usually what invites Stevens to start fighting to the best of his ability. You know what I mean? It's kind of there's a very fine line to walk when you're fighting a guy like Jeremy Stevens. You can take the tack that Cub Swanson ended up taking down the stretch, where he had to really kind of focus on nullifying and not giving Stevens any invitations to exchange, not ever allowing him to plant his feet and trade, just sort of frustrating the attempts enough that he never woke up. I don't think Emmett can really manage that, and I think that's really kind of the one way to consistently beat Jeremy Stevens, unless you have some kind of dramatic physical or skill advantage over him in another area.
Yeah, I don't disagree with any. I don't disagree with any of that. Like, Stevens has been kind of inconsistent and up and down. You pointed to the Renato Moicano fight. I think that was just a real tough matchup for him.
Yeah.
I think a kind of a long, rangy guy who knows how to keep a distance, but who isn't going to get drawn into a real firefight.
Right.
Like,
just didn't want to trade. He just negated it all.
Yeah, I think that's really tough for him. And a guy who was a good enough wrestler and dangerous enough on the ground to kind of make Stevens think twice about mixing things up.
Mm-hmm.
I think that kind of matchup is just always going to be tough for him. I don't know that Emmett is that guy.
No, doesn't seem like it.
If you're willing to trade with Stevens, very few guys have ever really gotten the better of him in those kinds of exchanges. Like, let's look at Stevens's record here. I mean, he beat the crap out of Gilbert Melendez when Melendez was willing to exchange with him. He beat the crap out of Doo Ho Choi when Choi was willing to exchange with him.
Mm-hmm.
He definitely got the better of the exchanges against Hanan Barrow. Max Holloway beat him basically by negating the exchanges. He eventually got the better of the exchanges with Dennis Bermudez. Like, the dude, if you fight the kind of fight that Jeremy Stevens can excel in, Jeremy Stevens is probably going to beat you in that kind of fight. I mean, I think Cub Swanson, almost 4 years ago, was the last guy to fight a Jeremy Stevens kind of fight in stretches and still win.
Yeah, and there was definitely a moment in that fight where it was like Cub had to decide to stop fighting Jeremy Stevens' fight. And also Jeremy Stevens broke his hand. So that fight definitely did have a tone change in the middle of it. Yeah, I think you're right. Like, there's the only time I can think of, honestly, I'm racking my brain, the only time I can think of where, like, Stevens got caught out in an exchange was that Eve Edwards fight. There was the one time when he got knocked out with a counter right hook, and it was just like it was like the one of Eve Edwards' slickest moments. A beautiful setup, and pretty much otherwise, if you are exchanging with Jeremy Stevens, you're probably losing the fight. So yeah, I think Josh Emmett is going to lose, and I think that will be a sort of predictable end to a main event that nobody really asked for. Let's move on.
Well, but I think it'll be. I think it's worth pointing out. Like, yeah, nobody is asking for this, but it's going to be fun.
Oh, absolutely.
Sure. Like,
yeah.
there's no way this isn't going to be. I think there's a very, very low chance this isn't going to be a fun fight.
Yeah.
I think Emmett is going to come out and look to put it on Stevens and try to kind of get in his face and throw combinations. Stevens is going to eat some of those shots and eventually find ways to adjust. I think we'll eventually see Stevens kind of find his range, flick his jab out there, work his low kicking game, and then I think probably catch Emmett with something big in an exchange. Yeah,
it's just that this is what UFC cards look like now. And we just have to like it. It's like Fight Pass all over again. Of course, it'll be fun. It'll be fine. Just like last weekend's card was a blast to watch. It's just that, like, they didn't advertise it, and there was no self-advertising because it didn't have any compelling narrative. It didn't have there was no magnetism around it. So that's all it is. That's all. Same shit I've been bitching about endlessly for the past several weeks. So on that note, let's move on. We got the co-main event here. Just a few words on this. Jessica Andrade versus Tecia Torres. I think that's a very compelling matchup. I think this is also Tecia Torres' opportunity to break through and to actually establish herself as one of the best fighters in the division and a genuine contender. She had that opportunity last time around when she took on Rose Namajunas. I think a win over Michelle Waterson puts her definitely back in the conversation, but Jessica Andrade is like, people have their eyes on her as a notable challenger. She's had some really impressive, dominant performances here. So from a career perspective, I like this one for both women. As far as the matchup is concerned, It's a weird clash of two styles, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Well, you have short out fighter versus short pressure fighter.
Right. Yeah.
Which is kind of a weird combination of things, because Andrade does a fantastic job of pressuring and getting inside and making the most of the opportunities when she does get inside. Torres makes it really difficult for you to do that. Torres fights incredibly long for somebody who is generously listed at 5 feet tall. She does a really excellent job of setting a long distance, of keeping her opponents off of her. The thing that I'm looking for here, because I think the striking matchup is about 50-50. I don't say that lightly. I mean, I really think that there will be stretches where Torres manages to keep a distance and pick Andrade apart, and then I think there will be stretches where Andrade manages to get inside and just blast Torres with combinations. What I look for is what seems to me to be kind of a deterioration in Tecia Torres' defensive wrestling game. There was a long time where Torres was almost impossible to take down. She was really, really hard to take down. She didn't get taken down in a fight until she fought Rose Namajunas, despite having a lot of opponents who tried. A lot of opponents tried to take down Tecia Torres and could not do it. Going back to her Invicta career, she had incredibly strong hips, was really, really hard to get to the mat. Then Rose took her down twice, Beck Rawlings took her down, Juliana Lima took her down, and Michelle Waterson took her down twice in their fight.
That's the one that stands out as the Michelle Waterson fight, right? Mm-hmm. Waterson's not a great... I'm okay with her giving up 1 of 3 attempts to Juliana Lima, who is, one of the better wrestlers in the division. Michelle Waterson... the tiny atom weight who is like a karate fighter. That seems like a strange one to give up 2 takedowns to her. I'm not sure I understand that. Yeah, well, I mean, what do you think is the cause of this deterioration?
So Waterson is not a bad wrestler, but the reason why that one stands out, she's especially explosive in the clinch with kind of trips and throws. Sure. She's technically gifted, but what stands out to me there is that Waterson is not physical.
Yeah, right.
That Torres, it seems to me, is getting kind of muscled around by fighters like Rawlings and Lima, big, strong fighters. Namajunas, not really that physical. Mm-hmm. She's explosive, but she's not physical. That's why I think if Andrade gets her hands on her, she is just going to hoss Torres. Mm-hmm. I think the gap in physical strength in this fight is going to be shockingly wide. That the second that Andrade gets her hands on Torres, it's going to look like a whole different fight. So that's why I lean towards Andrade here for that reason. I think that I think she is going to struggle to get inside. But if there's anything that we know about Jessica Andrade, it's that when she gets inside, she makes the absolute most of the opportunities that she does get.
Oh, 100%. Female John Lineker to the core. And Andrade even had, she had that effect on Claudia Gadelha. Granted, Gadelha has had a long-standing issue with sort of wearing herself out. And that happened in that fight, but it did have the feeling of once Andrade got to fight the kind of fight she wanted, she just started winning the whole match. And it feels like that'll be especially true here because really, I think Tecia Torres could probably be an atomweight. She's really tiny for the division, even though she's pretty muscular. Obviously, she is among the very smallest fighters in the UFC strawweight division. So, yeah, I think that might just be the X factor for me too. It kind of makes me feel bad. I want to see Tecia Torres break through. I think she's got a lot of potential, and it's not like it's done for her yet. But she's 28. She's getting to the point where it should be, make or break. I think, and it always feels like there's a Jessica Andrade. There's just something in the way. She's just not quite at that level.
Well, one of the things that compels me about this division is that there is actually a lot of talent in it.
Sure.
We talked a little while ago about about how kind of ridiculous women's flyweight looked after they introduced it. At some point, if there's ever another women's bantamweight title fight, we will probably talk about how relatively devoid of talent that division is. Yeah. Strawweight is fucking full of good, fun fighters. Mm-hmm. The top 10 at strawweight is young. It's developing. They're all getting better from fight to fight. Joanna Jędrzejczyk has only been a pro for 6 years. Rose Namajunas has only been a pro for 6 years. It is full of prime fighters who are going to get much better before any of them start to fall off. That's a division, every once in a while, people are like, oh, boring fight night, lots of women's fights. Like, not women's strawweights fight.
Oh, absolutely, never.
Those are fun.
Never. Women's strawweight is that's why it's almost a complete shock that it exists. It's so much fun, the UFC women's strawweight division, because otherwise they have gone in the most insane order possible with adding their divisions. They went for bantamweight and flyweight and featherweight all before they ever got to atomweight. It's shocking that they managed to get strawweight in there as their second women's division, but it was a good choice. It's undeniably one of the most talent-rich divisions in the UFC, I think. So, yeah. But, it's hard to make it when you're like a Tecia Torres, who doesn't particularly have any standout skills in one area or another, or standout physicality compared to your opposition. It's hard to make it in that kind of stacked division. I do want to talk about the welterweights here, Pat. I want to talk about Mike Perry and Max Griffin. And I want to talk about this largely from a development perspective, because this is obviously being slated as a comeback fight for Mike Perry after an entertaining but decisive loss to Santiago Ponzinibbio in his last fight. And I am not convinced the UFC knows what they're doing, making this the comeback, the tune-up fight for Mike Perry. Like, if this is a tune-up, it's some fucking tune-up. Max Griffin is very dangerous, is why I say this. Max Griffin is... he's certainly not on the Santiago Ponzinibbio level and has not proven himself to be that kind of fighter yet. But he is athletic, he hits very hard, and he is very, very willing to exchange. So he strikes me as just another Mike Perry opponent, essentially. The same kind of guy that Mike Perry has been fighting each time he's gotten anything resembling a step up in the UFC has been somebody who will go to war with him. And both you and I think that Mike Perry has the talent to be a really special fighter. And I don't think he's going to get there being matched like this, where even his quote-unquote easy fights are kind of torturous in certain ways.
Yeah, so I think that the UFC has more or less decided that Perry is an action guy. And we've talked about this a little bit, but I kind of think that's a mistake given where he is in development.
Mm-hmm. I agree. He's 26 years old. Guy debuted in 2014. Like, the sky is still the limit for Mike Perry. And he has been making marked improvements and changes to his game. It's not as if he's the same guy he was when he got signed to the UFC. In fact, when he first got signed, I didn't take him seriously at all. When he was set up to fight Hyung-Gyu Lim, what he had shown in the regional circuit before that was nothing like some of the really impressive stuff we've seen inside the octagon.
Yeah. He's a dude who is developing really fast. He doesn't have that much experience. He's acquiring it very quickly, and he seems to pick things up very fast. He like Ponzinibbio is a fully developed prime fighter. That dude has all the skills he's probably going to have.
Yeah, pretty much.
Sorry, I'm now chatting with the UFC Fight Pass people to try and figure out why it's not working on my computer.
That's all right. I love this. Mid-show, UFC support. What the fuck is happening?
Yeah. Yeah. Sorry. Okay. So,
I mean, what are they saying? What do they have to say?
Are you able to replicate this issue on another PC or device? I said no. It's working on it's working on a PC that I'm currently borrowing. So why isn't it working on the device that I want to use it on, which I'm paying for? Fuck these people, man. Absolutely, just fuck. Oh my god.
You're talking to support, aka the intern who designed the website.
Yeah, basically. Yeah. So the issue here is. Yeah, I mean, I think Perry's going to win this fight. I think he's going to win it fairly big. Sure. I feel your concern, but I think there are two ways of looking at this. One is to say that the UFC doesn't actually understand what they have talent-wise in Perry, and I think there's a strong chance that that's the case. I think the other is to say they are giving him time to round out and develop his skills in fights that are going to make him a known name.
Sure.
I think that's the other side of it.
There's no doubt that Perry has already established himself as like must-see TV because of the tenure of all of his UFC fights.
Yeah, so he is. I really think, yes, Griffin is not an easy matchup for him by any stretch of the imagination, but I think it's a fight that Perry should win, and should win fairly handily, because Griffin is pretty hittable.
For sure.
That's the kind of basic dynamic of this fight is Perry is going to hit it. Griffin is going to hit Perry, probably, but Perry is also going to hit Griffin. And I think Perry is going to hit Griffin much harder and finish him.
Yeah, I have no doubt that Mike Perry's almost certainly going to win. Yeah, I have no doubt that he's almost certainly going to win. You like that? Many layers of subterfuge there. I think it's definitely like it's clearly being made for him to win. I just think like they're clearly their focus in matching him is on making sure we have action fights, and that's a tough way to build a guy when he only ever has action fights. Mike Perry has been making changes remarkably well, I think, given the fact that he's basically only had two kinds of UFC opponent, that being one who goes to war with him and one whom is really just put in there for him to get back on track. But this is a first step in the, oh, you're getting back on track, but not really easily direction that kind of has me worried. So I don't know. We'll see. We'll see how it plays out. But it will be fun to watch. I can almost guarantee that. Let's take a break, actually. When we come back, we're going to get into, I think, just one more fight from this undercard. Pat, you wanted to talk about Gilbert Burns versus Olivier Mercier, which I think is a pretty fascinating matchup.
Yeah, so I think it's a fun fight.
We'll get into that after this.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for listening to this week's Heavy Hands. If you like what you hear, please consider pledging to support the podcast on Patreon. Patreon is basically continuous crowdfunding. You sign up to contribute a certain amount per month to help us with production costs and the like, and in return you get rewards ranging from a mention on the Heavy Hands website to a question or topic of your choice being discussed on the show. We have a lot more in the works to reward you for your help, and we appreciate every contribution. No amount is too small. Just head over to patreon.com and find how you can help out, the only show dedicated to the finer points of face punching. Now let's get back to it.
All right, man. You ready to dive in?
Let's do it. I'm
going
to strangle this motherfucker.
I'm so sorry. I really am not laughing at your misery. And we are back to talk about the rest of this card, meaning one more fight. Let's go ahead and talk about Gilbert Burns versus Olivia Mercier. Are we still thinking of either of these guys as like developing? Where are they going to end up fighters, Pat?
I don't think so. No, they're both in their mid prime.
Yeah.
Mercier, I think, is a 6-year pro this year. I think Burns is also a 6-year pro this year. These guys are about at the point where they should be starting to make their run toward the top 15 if that's going to happen. They're both riding winning streaks. 3 fights for Mercier and
Burns just won his last one.
Burns just won his last one. Yeah, Burns got soundly out wrestled by Michel Prazeres.
He got Prazeresed.
Yep, that happens.
Happens to the best of us.
But I thought Burns looked a lot better against Sago. I thought he showed off a lot of improvements. Now, the problem here is that Burns is going to get taken down in this fight a lot, and Mercier is a good enough grappler to just control him in those exchanges. Even though Burns is an exceptionally gifted grappler, I think offensive I think the kind of like stifling grappling will always outweigh a dangerous bottom game.
Yeah, I think you need like the only guy that Mercier has struggled with on the floor really was Carlos Diego Ferreira. Ferreira, he had a hard time getting him down, and then he got him down once, I think, and got quickly reversed and ended up on his back. But that's Carlos Diego Ferreira's game is like he's got a very good sweep game. He's a good scrambler. He kind of works towards dominant position as one of his main focuses. And Gilbert Burns does not seem to have that. I think he probably has the skills to do that, but stylistically, he seems a lot more willing to this day to sort of spend time on his back playing for submissions. And
yeah, I mean, I think I don't think there's any problem with Burns's game per se. I just think that was 2 years ago. I think that was the first really elite grappler that Mercier had faced. And sure. Where Mercier was also not quite as confident in his striking game on the feet as a backup.
True.
I don't know, but that's what makes this fight interesting. Is Mercier could run into the same kinds of problems that he had when he fought Ferreira. And so if this becomes a striking match, then it's probably a fight that favors Burns by a substantial margin.
Yeah, it seems to me like based on the way he's being matched that they are still treating Olivier Mercier as someone who might go somewhere, because he's getting like it's like, okay, we found out Carlos Diego Ferreira, wild but insistent counter striking is too much for you to deal with right now. So now we're just going to give you guys who are still clearly learning some aspect of the game. So the next striker you face is like Tony Martin, like who is just learning to be a striker and is otherwise just a big, strong grappler. And then next up, we'll give you Gilbert Burns, who's kind of the same way, but based on where Martin was at that time, it's just a little further along that track of just starting to really get comfortable with his hands. And so it's like they're bringing Olivier Albin Mercier along by degrees. Where you don't have to...
It's weird. I mean, like, I think he's a good fighter, but not like the kind of future contender who needs to be brought along that way. Like, It's kind of strange to me that they're like, oh, this is the guy. This is the guy. We're going to see if he can do it. It's like, he has been in the UFC for 4 years, man.
Yeah, I think they really want another GSP. Like, they really want another French-Canadian guy that they can, who's clean cut and nice, and they can just sell to anyone. What do you like about Gilbert Burns' striking that we have seen? Like, what are the improvements that you have noticed? Because he did look good against Jason Sago in moments, but he also, like, he threw a lot of wild looping overhand rights in that fight. He looked like he knew his distance better than he had before. That was like the big change to me, is that he looked like he was on target with these wild punches, even if he was getting a little wild in the process.
I also I thought this was a fight where normally Burns throws a really nice straight right hand. I think that if he was throwing overhands, it was intentional, and I think it's because of how Sago holds his left hand. Like, I think Sago tends to drop his left and leave room to throw over his left hand. So I don't know. Maybe he looked a little bit wild. I don't know. I just thought he looked sharper in kind of in general in that fight.
He looked confident. It was there was more wildness, I think, in his hands than we've seen in some past bouts. You and I always described Gilbert Burns as like the hero on the punch mitts, the guy who looked amazing on pads. And had great form, and then it wasn't quite there in the fight. It's almost like learning to loosen up the technique was a good thing for him. Just learning to just get there and feel how the actual fight is playing out, rather than just sort of running through the rehearsed moves.
We've talked about this before with Henry Hooft trained strikers, where they look really good at first, then they have some growing pains, and then eventually they look really good again.
Yeah, as the level of competition improves, they kind of grow along with it. So hopefully Burns is getting there. Prediction for that fight? You think Albin Mercier is just going to out-grapple Burns?
Yeah, I think he probably grinds him out.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't know. I think Burns might be just a little too, like, mean for Olivier. Yeah, but maybe. I mean, out-grappling Tony Martin, like, that's a big fucking guy. Yeah, okay. I'm going to agree with you. I'm just going to chicken out and side with Olivia Albin Mercier out-grappling him. And with that, let's go ahead and move on. Let's talk about last week's card. There was a lot of exciting shit to talk about on this one, and we haven't necessarily planned what we're going to discuss, so we'll just go ahead and jump in on the main event, if that's cool with you, Pat.
That's very cool with me.
Cowboy Cerrone, not done yet. Got a buzzer-beater finish over Yancy Medeiros, 2 seconds left in the first round. Stopped him with a combination ending on the right hand after 2 knockdowns, both of which were preceded by Medeiros cracking Cerrone on the chin with a clean shot. This was an insane one-round fight. It was crazy.
It was wild, man. I think I was of two minds with it. At first, I was watching Cerrone and I thought, man, he does not look right. This does not look good. I thought he looked real planted, and not in the way that he has looked planted in past fights where it wasn't necessarily a bad thing. I thought he looked bad planted, like kind of slow to react. Then, as the fight went on, I realized, like, I think this is the adjustment that he's making, because he's old and he knows he's old, and he realizes that he needs to make some adjustments to his game. And so I think his adjustment has been becoming a better counter striker. So once he got through the first couple of minutes and saw the stuff that Medeiros was throwing at him, he did I thought, a really good job of evading as Medeiros came in, and then finding new angles from which to land counters, which is what led directly to the finish, to the knockdowns and the finish. So I think there's kind of a ceiling on that, as kind of a very upright and tall counterpuncher who is hittable early and doesn't have the world's strongest chin. That's like, there's a limit to what you can do with that. But I also think that's going to buy Cerrone another couple of years as a top 10 to 15 fighter, when a lot of other guys might be done at that point.
A lot of other guys would be done by this point, Cerrone has had one hell of a career, and he the way he talked about it, the guy said he wants 4 fights this next year. 4 fights in 2018. He's not ready to settle down yet. Probably is burning through those paychecks the same way he always used to, despite the fact that I hope they've gotten bigger over the years. I think in a lot of ways it was a typical Donald Cerrone performance, right? In a lot of ways it was like an archetypal Cerrone fight where he just kind of struggled early. I actually really thought Medeiros did a fine job of pressuring him. That was one of the things that we both identified he would need to do to be effective, and we thought he would lose because he's not really much of a pressure fighter. And he still didn't pressure the whole time. It was still kind of in bursts, but they were longer bursts than they usually are. It was like he came into this fight knowing that he had to get after Cerrone early. And he did a pretty good job staying on him. And I just think, that gave Cerrone some issues. That's what it looked like to me. I mean, he definitely looked a little flat, just like he did at the start of the Darren Till fight. But again, like the Till fight, we have somebody with a reach advantage over Cerrone, something that he never used to experience at lightweight, and which he had not really experienced at welterweight until he fought Till. I guess there was the Masvidal fight, and that one went the wrong way as well. I think that reach advantage makes a real difference for Cerrone. It really makes him uncomfortable. And then we have the slow start. And both of those things, Medeiros just was difficult early. But yeah, the counterpunching of Cerrone was pretty nice. I don't think he was comfortable the whole time he was counterpunching. I think he did have to kind of convince himself to do it. I don't think it's in his nature, and he just doesn't like people getting in his face right from the opening bell. But he was actually cycling through different ways of moving his head and putting together counterpunches afterward. It definitely struck me as a fight which he had specifically prepared those combinations for Yancy Medeiros. He'd done a lot of pad work, focusing on his triggers and firing back 4 or 5 different ways.
You could see the Brandon Gibson there.
Yes,
that's
for sure.
That to me was the really clear thing about this, is that I think you can tell over the last couple of years, fights where Cerrone has been on, you can see the Brandon Gibson very clearly. In fights where he hasn't been on, I think for whatever reason, you don't see the Gibson stuff quite as strongly. The Darren Till thing, I could picture in my head the look on Brandon's face watching Cerrone fight that fight, which is Donald, what are you doing, man? This is not what we worked on. This is not what we did. I mean, and I really like Brandon. I enjoy hanging out and chatting with him. But I can see this look on his face very clearly, where he knows they've put the work in. And with Cerrone is just the kind of dude where sometimes it just doesn't happen. It just doesn't play out the way that you want it to, because he gets in his head, or his head is somewhere else. Those are both things that happen with Cerrone, and because he fights so often, you get a chance to see those patterns play out more than you do with most fighters who are not competing quite as often.
Right.
But yeah, I thought this was a fight where you could see Cerrone executed what they had worked on pretty much to a T. Would he have wanted to get hit a little less? Yeah, he probably did not want to get hit quite that much, but what he had prepared worked, and Cerrone believed in it, and it did. Were you struck? It didn't seem like Cerrone kicked hardly at all.
No, I think that was a deliberate choice. I think he threw body kicks when Medeiros was at range, but Medeiros did start to pressure him as a result of that. And I think it was a deliberate choice, because both Masvidal and Till fucked him up with counters as he was kicking, trying to play a kicking game off the back foot. And he's just too tall, and his chin is too precarious a target to get away with that, I think, against somebody who can close the gap quickly with that reach advantage and really ding him with a clean shot.
That's something I want to come back to when we talk about James Vick, is because Cerrone for so long was such a pronounced leg kicker, and has had substantially less success with that in his last few fights, as guys have done a better job of pressuring him for a variety of things. But it struck me too in watching the Vick Trinaldo fight that Trinaldo did not just kick Vick's legs. Vick's legs were there to be kicked that whole fight. They were right there. And Trinaldo preferred to go to the body. But it got me thinking about kind of the limitations of leg kicking in MMA. That I do not think a lot of guys do it with the kind of acumen that they should. Leg kicking is an art at the highest levels. And I think even the best leg kickers that we've seen in MMA have not been up to standards that we see in like Dutch style.
Sure.
But there's no reason that they couldn't be. Like, I think it's genuinely an area where there's a lot of potential for technical development, because leg kicking, and I think the reason why Trinaldo didn't do it against Vick is because he was worried about eating a straight right counter when he did it.
Yeah.
Well, but like, you don't have to get countered as you throw leg kicks. You know, like there are ways. Well, I mean, that sounds kind of dumb. So let me expand. When you throw low kicks, there are ways to be defensively responsible and mix up the angle and mix up your head position and mix up your defense in ways that make it much less likely that you're going to eat a counter that you really need to worry about. There are still going to be risks, but you can mitigate those risks in ways that make consistent low kicking a much more effective strategy when you're fighting guys, when you're fighting tall, rangy guys. So for Cerrone against Yancy Medeiros, or against Darren Till, or for Francisco Trinaldo against James Vick, you can pull your head off the center line in kind of unpredictable ways. You can play with a guard as you throw that. Like, lots of guys in MMA do not pay attention to what they're doing with their hands when they throw a low kick. Their hands come down, or their hands kind of shoot off to the sides, whatever. Like, that's one way of throwing a low kick. You can throw a low kick with a double forearms guard.
Yeah,
it doesn't have quite as much pop on it, but it's much more defensively responsible.
I have a feeling we'll be seeing some of that from Gokhan Saki whenever he returns from whatever his mysterious ailment is.
Yeah, I mean, or you can throw. I like a cross arm guard where you chop down with the hand on the kicking leg, and you bring your other arm. You bring your other arm up to kind of guard your face as you throw. But there are ways you can pull your head offline as you throw it. You can stay more upright. You can take small angles into the kicks. Those are not things that that you see a ton of in MMA. That it's genuinely an area, like we've discussed with boxing and footwork, where there's a lot of room for improvement.
Yeah. It's also about creating the body position to make the kick effective.
Yes.
To either catch the person putting their weight on the leg, or if they are trying to counter, to get them to lean away and leave that leg behind. You know, like what Henry Hooft was screaming at Luke Rockhold to do to Yoel Romero throughout the entirety of their bout. Because that's a big thing in Dutch kickboxing. That's a valid point. And on that note, I guess we have to talk about Derek Lewis versus Marcin Tybura before we talk about Vick Trinaldo, but only briefly. Yeah. It was like every Derek Lewis fight.
God, I love him so much because his fights essentially defy analysis in so many different ways. Like, how do you predict a Derek Lewis fight?
The fight kind of sucked, and then he decided to knock Tybura out.
Which is like every other fucking Derek Lewis fight. There's no way of expressing that analytically, I don't think. Like, I don't think there are matchups that he is more or less likely to win or lose. Which is the kind of bizarre thing, right? It's not like, Derek Lewis really struggles against elite strikers, or Derek Lewis really struggles against highly accomplished control wrestlers. Like, he may knock you out or he may not. And the kind of matchup that you present to him is effectively irrelevant to that. He just like, yeah. I mean, if you ran back the Hunt fight, there's every bit as big a chance, instead of Hunt getting finished, that Lewis would have just landed a shot to put Hunt down. Yeah. Like, every fight with Lewis is literally just a fucking coin flip as to whether he gets tired and worn out on the ground, or he gets kind of beaten up by a slightly more technically skilled striker who manages to not get knocked out, or he just fucking flatlines you. Like, I don't know how to analyze it any more than that, except to say I thought Lewis's hands are looking increasingly good. I think he's an increasingly technically skilled striker on the feet.
Yeah, there were a couple things that stood out. One, it didn't feel like Lewis did as much aimless kicking which I like.
Yeah,
because
I was going to mention that.
he has been throwing so many just big, giant, explosive kicks and flying knees and all this stuff that A, takes way too much energy when you were Derek Lewis's size to be making that a regular part of your game. And B, he never set any of them up because he doesn't set anything up. So kicks are particularly risky if you're not going to set up your strikes. So I like the fact that he seemed to focus more on his hands. He also seemed to finally make the next logical step in the Derek Lewis universal game plan, which is don't do too much until the fight's over, because at any moment you'll get a chance to knock them out. It's just wait and now the next logical step is to do that and to counter while you're doing that, to wait for the other guy to try to do something, and that's when you try to do something. The first 2 times he sat Tibora down, it was with a really nice counter straight right hand. And Lewis has so much power and so much speed on those power punches when he explodes that he could just throw the same right hand over and over. And a lot of heavyweights are not going to be quick enough to get out of the way if they've already committed to attacking. So I liked that. And then the third point, he stayed exceptionally calm on the ground, which is something that we have talked about several times on this show, and I have talked about elsewhere many times, but that's because it's like the only area of Derek Lewis's game that I've been able to latch onto as something that makes sense for so many years now. It seems that Derek Lewis, he stayed very, very chill and relaxed on the ground. He did not panic. He barely even cared about position. He was only focused on staying safe and conserving energy, and it worked, because he wasn't too dead tired in the third round to do Derek Lewis things to Marcin Tybur's chin. So, yep, it happened. And now it's done. On to the next Derek Lewis fight. By the way, Derek Lewis shouted out Deep Sex, Trey the Truth, and what else did he talk? Oh, and Bellator. 3 things he mentioned in his post-fight interview that I never thought I would hear talked about on a UFC broadcast. So, That's love.
Derek Lewis, baby.
Much love to Derek Lewis. Why don't we take a quick break, in fact? We'll take a little break. When we come back, we're going to get into the rest of this card, what interested us. Namely, we're going to talk about James Vick versus Francisco Trinaldo, and a few other quick looks after that. We are going to answer some questions from our patrons after this. Financial support is fantastic, but there are other, even easier ways to support Heavy Hands. Perhaps the best is by spreading the word. We know our fan base. You're all cool, popular people with serious social media presences. You're tastemakers and trendsetters. Okay, there are 1 or 2 of you that don't fit that description. You know who you are, but no matter what, you can always help us out by telling folks about the show. And you can also give us a positive rating and review on iTunes and Stitcher, things like that. We rely on word of mouth and positive feedback to grow and improve, so thank you very much for your time and your help. Now, back to the show. All right, welcome back to Heavy Hands. I am not playing a reluctant game of fetch with the cat sitting next to me right now, and here we are to talk about James Vick versus Francisco Trinaldo. Frankie Redwood did not get it done. Sad as it makes me to say that. James Vick did, I think, a very good job of frustrating Trinaldo's best efforts, although I think there are certainly some improvements you could suggest for Trinaldo in how to approach a similar matchup next time and come away with the win. What did you think of the fight, man?
I thought that Vick has evolved into one of the very best outfighters, like a really dedicated outfighter. I think he does the stick and move thing better than just about anybody. He uses his height beautifully. He uses his length beautifully, which is not the same thing. He's got great instincts for when to move and in what directions to move. I think this was the fight that finally kind of sold me on him as like an elite guy. For years, I've been kind of like, I think like his tendency of just gouging guys' eyes out has really turned me against him. And also the way that he just got flattened by Beneil Dariush. Yeah. I'm like, oh, if you can pressure him, if you're willing to get in his face and you feel comfortable with that, you're just gonna beat him.
Yeah. And yet Trinaldo did a very good job of pressuring. He stayed on Vick as best he could, I think. It was a difficult matchup for Trinaldo. Vick made it difficult on him because, as you said, like
we know he has this insane frame, but he is really, really learning to use it now. He does fantastic work with his jab from long range. He does a great job, like Stephen Thompson often does, of pressuring opponents back, of sort of reasserting himself on the front foot when he feels that he's been pushed back for a little too long, that the other guy's getting comfortable moving forward. I think, especially because of his insane height, that double step knee, jump knee that he likes to throw going forward is really, really dangerous. Trinaldo certainly never tried to counter it or do anything with it, because every time it showed up, it was like mere inches from his chin. And so he had to back up and get away from there. So I thought Vick did a great job of sort of managing the distance and managing the flow of the fight, like preventing Trinaldo from ever really being able to roughhouse him or mix it up. He never allowed Trinaldo to just set his feet in close range. And so Trinaldo only ever really got into the body, had a couple shots upstairs, but really was like kind of nullified by Vick.
Yeah. I really thought, based on the footwork and kind of the opening couple of minutes of the fight, that eventually Trinaldo was going to work his way inside and make Vick pay. That looked like the flow of the fight to me, the dimension of the fight, with how Trinaldo was cutting him off, with how he was going to the body, with how he was moving into his counters as he threw them. I really thought that eventually he was going to get there and kind of do something that was going to put Vick off his game. And instead, Vick was the one who adjusted. Vick confused Trinaldo's pressure. He made it hard for Trinaldo to get inside. He did a great job of setting the distance. That tricky little side kick he was throwing was excellent.
Absolutely. And also gave me secondhand frustration, because I think everyone's had this experience. I've sparred those people. The really fucking tall, lanky guy who throws lots of side kicks. It's infuriating, and it's infuriating for a reason. Vick needed to infuriate and frustrate Francisco Trinaldo. He needed to just put something in his way every single time he wanted to come forward, and he did that. He did that brilliantly. And by the way, like, Frankie Redwood is, I think, still getting better, is still getting more comfortable and making improvements as a fighter. He looked really solid in this fight. And honestly, a couple years ago, I'm not sure that Trinaldo would have been as effective as he was in this fight down the stretch. I really have to give some credit to his ability to manage his energy, to know when he can sort of get a rest and get his breath back, especially because he was left in a very difficult position in this matchup. He had no sort of safety zone, because he couldn't, like, Vick had the luxury of chilling at times, he had this huge reach advantage, and he was using it so well. He could sort of mentally relax, knowing that he was not in danger, that if he ever was in danger, Trinaldo would have to precede it with a massive leap forward before he was really threatened. Whereas Trinaldo was just like perpetually on the end of Vick's legs and arms, was just on the end of those strikes. So his only choice was the pressure. He had to keep coming forward, or else he was just getting picked apart. And he did that without really tiring himself out. I thought he looked really quite fresh all the way to the end of the bout. And that was because he was using those moments when he was just having to walk Vick down to sort of recover, and sort of spreading out when he would explode on a big shot. I think he just needed to, like, work the body and as you said before, work the legs a little more. Just take what's there and don't hunt for that crazy Luke Rockhold altitude chin more than you need to.
Yeah, I mean, I really think, like, the guy who beats Vick is going to be either somebody who, like, I think Khabib would just blast forward, stick him against the fence, and kind of repeatedly take him down.
Sure.
But I think anybody else who beats him, it's going to be because they cut off his movement with low kicks. Like, Trinaldo tried it with the body kick, but he couldn't do enough to stop Vick from moving the other direction, and he didn't throw it. I don't think he timed the kick especially well. Like, the key, if you're trying to use kicks to cut somebody off, is to catch them moving into it, to anticipate the directionality of their movement and then throw into them as they move. And Trinaldo didn't do that especially well, I didn't think. Like, that was supposed to be the thing that forced Vick back towards his right hand, or towards his right side, and it simplifies your pressure footwork if that's the case. But he didn't throw it consistently enough. he was the body kick. You have to be closer than with a low kick, so it kind of limits you in that regard. It was not the ideal tool. It was a tool, but it shouldn't have been the best or the only one for him to use. So if somebody's going to beat Vick in that division, I think somebody probably will. It's going to be somebody who just kicks the shit out of Vick's legs.
It'll probably be RDA. Oh, wait, RDA's at welterweight now. Damn.
Yep.
Well, Vick will be there soon enough, right? He's got to be. He is literally... Honestly, if Luke Rockhold's hairline continues to recede, he will just be James Vick. We will have two James Vicks in the UFC, except one of them will be an almost light heavyweight, and one of them somehow manages to make 155.
Yeah, I don't know how he makes 155. That's just nuts.
He's 6'3". He's the same size as Luke Rockhold. It does not make sense.
No.
Yeah. But I really liked what I saw from Vick, and I have loved the tenor of the changes he's been making. I don't know if he's always done this, but he had himself announced as a boxer. Has that always been his style when the announcer reads his name? I don't think it has.
He's a Golden Gloves guy, isn't he?
Is he? Mm-hmm. Oh, I guess I didn't know that. Probably because up until his last 3 fights, he has not really looked like much of a boxer. He has, I think, felt more vulnerable because of his height and really succumbed to pressure a little too easily. He just he looked so comfortable using his reach and just constantly making it something that Trinaldo had to deal with. It was, a really sharp performance from him. So looking forward to see where he goes in the future at lightweight. Let's talk about Curtis Millender over Thiago Alves. I didn't realize this. I don't think I really took this into account as much as I should have, but Curtis Millender is maybe just now entering his prime. And so when I predicted this fight last week on the Vivisection over on Bloody Elbow, I kind of had to... I was taking into account some of the losses that Millender has had, and I thought this was going to be a pretty interesting, closely matched fight. I thought that Alves' experience could give him problems. I thought ultimately the style matchup, with Alves being more of a counterpuncher in his late career and not really being comfortable pressuring, that would probably give Millender the edge. But this was maybe Millender's sharpest technical performance ever, at least just based on what I've seen.
He's super young in his career still.
Right.
He's only been fighting as a pro for 4.5, 5 years.
Yeah, and that is what I don't think I quite fully realized when I was thinking about this matchup last week.
Well, because he's had a lot of fights. He's had 17 pro fights, or 17 or 18 pro fights now. So he's got a lot of experience for a guy who's that young. When normally you see a guy who's 14-3, that's somebody who started fighting in 2009.
Right.
You know? So I think it's easy to look at Millender and think oh yeah, this dude is more or less a finished product. He's not even close to being a finished product. And I think he's an interesting stylistic matchup for other guys in this division, which is full of dudes who want to wrestle you. With that kind of length and that kind of volume and that ability to touch and move, that makes him an interesting kind of addition here. Dudes like Millender are always really interesting to me, who rack up a lot of experience on the regional scene, good experience, his 3 losses, only one of them I would classify as kind of a bad loss. His other losses were to Fernando Gonzalez, who's a really good striker, and to Brennan Ward, who's a legit fighter.
Yeah.
So and I think was that Ward loss at middleweight too? Did he used to be a middleweight?
Doesn't look like it.
No, okay, I'm wrong about that. Sorry.
The Eddie Mendez bout was a catchweight, 175.
Okay.
That was the bad loss.
Yeah, and even that is not a terrible loss. And Mendez is a UFC veteran. He fought, who did he fight? The short dude from the first season of Tough Brazil.
Oh, God. Who's that?
Daniel Sarafian.
Oh, Daniel Sarafian, okay.
Yeah.
That guy. Remember him?
Yeah. I do, unfortunately.
There was a time when they did Tough Brazil where it was maybe Daniel Sarafian's important.
It's not important. But anyway, yeah, Millender looks like a nice little addition here.
Yeah, he looked fantastic. But seriously, based on what we've seen from him before, coming into this fight, he was just to me, sort of the goofy head kick guy. He obviously had some serious talent. And some real impressive dexterity. He would do a lot of things in previous fights, like catch an inside leg kick. It throws you out of stance, but you ride the movement and throw a head kick with the other leg. That's how he got a knockout in his last fight.
doing just that. Sort of weird movements that did take advantage of what is a pretty freaky frame for a welterweight. Got very long legs in particular. He has some John Jones-esque legs for sure. Although not quite as scrawny, so that's a good sign for him, I guess. But he was like, his counter punches looked a lot better here. His distance measuring with his hands, he looked a lot more comfortable. Now, some of this must have had to do with the fact that Thiago Alves was a particularly short opponent compared to some of the guys he's fought in the past. But Alves has been a short guy his whole career and is actually very good at dealing with it. And he really, really struggled to adapt to Melender. I think at the beginning he wanted to draw him in. It didn't work because when Alves was in the back foot, Melender was just happy to use his kicks. And then he wanted to push forward, and it turned out that Melender has gotten better at dealing with pressure. Like Alves wasn't pressuring even as well as like Trinaldo was in the next fight, but he was trying. He was trying to push forward. He was putting his punches together. He was doing things that would have shaken up a lot of less experienced fighters. And Melender wasn't shook at all. He reacted with really nice counter punches, a lot of same time counters. The knee he used to finish the fight, I just want to shout out very briefly. Not the kind of knee we tend to see all that often, especially in Western MMA. It really reminded me of like a Kyokushin karate move. When you see knee knockouts in Kyokushin or in other knockdown karate styles, you get a lot of these sort of like, I reach out, I touch your lapel or whatever, I find my distance, and I just stick the knee in your chin. It is like an uppercut. There's not a ton of load up. You don't have to leap into it. It is just sort of like placing the strike on the other person's chin, throwing the knee the way you would throw a punch in a combination. And it was like a beautiful knee that Melender landed. Just small, subtle, right on the point of the chin, super accurate, very little telegraph to it. That kind of thing has me excited to see what Curtis Melender may yet have to show us. So I'm into it. Now, to wrap things up, we have a couple questions from our patrons, 2 of them that we have selected. If, by the way, you are a supporter of the show on Patreon at the $5 level or above, and you have not submitted a question in a while, please go. There is a post on the Patreon that says, heavy bag questions needed. You can put your question in a comment there or send it to us as a message on Patreon. Send a message to the actual Heavy Hands Patreon account, and we'll start getting through these. Got 2 questions here today. First one from our friend Chris Reaney, who, by the way, we'll give him a little plug. You should check out on Twitter because he does a lot of really interesting fight-related art, and you guys would behoove yourselves to go look at that. Chris asks, or says rather, and then asks, it seems like the evolution of MMA in the first decade of the 21st century saw certain styles paired and evolving together, like wrestlers who boxed, or at least threw overhand rights, Chuck Liddell, etc., or Muay Thai strikers with jiu-jitsu skills like Vanderlei Silva, Shogun Hua, etc. Do you think these common pairings were based on complementary aspects of the styles, or were they more a product of the environment? Secondarily, does that make karate wrestlers like GSP or boxer jiu-jitsu players like BJ Penn and Nick Diaz more notable in the evolutionary timeline? So first part of that question, what's the reason for these common pairings that we have so frequently seen?
I think it's mostly an environmental thing.
Okay.
It's basically what is available to you where you train. And I think so in Brazil, the classic pairing was always Muay Thai and Jiu-Jitsu. Well, there are really good reasons why you could go to Brazil to learn Muay Thai and Jiu-Jitsu and why it would be harder to learn wrestling there. There are good reasons why you could learn a lot of wrestling in certain places, and the striking training that would be available to you there is boxing, because boxing is everywhere in the United States. A lot harder to find good qualified Muay Thai instructors in the United States than it is to find boxing coaches. As far as karate is concerned, karate is also in a lot of different places, now to find, so when you find a karate and wrestling guy like GSP, that's because that's what was available to him as a fighter, as he was coming up.
Yeah.
He learned karate as a youth, and then he learned wrestling because that's what was there for him.
Yeah, I think it is a bit of both, though, as well. Like, I think the fighters who excel with notable style combinations are the ones who do find the complementary aspects of their two styles.
Absolutely, no question.
Yeah, like GSP is well known for using, he himself said that the explosion that he sort of picked up as a karateka is what made him such an effective wrestler, or at least that's where he grounded that type of movement. In a lot of ways, like the very simple example of the wrestler who throws the overhand right, well, that stems from what's an easy, powerful punch to set up with a powerful threat of a takedown. These are complementary aspects that do play together, but the truth is, like, I think you're right, Pat. Like, there is no hard rule anywhere about what two styles or what three styles really work well together. It's about what level of training you have available to you and how well you can marry those two things, how well you can find where the intersections are. Because, like, I would say I think boxing and wrestling are like lovely companions in a lot of ways. But you could
because
also
of the range aspect, right? Because boxing tends to be contested at a closer range, whereas if you want to be a real sharp kickboxer, then there might be some issues stylistically making that meld with the wrestling game.
Yeah, but there are also ways in which boxing and wrestling don't seem like very good bedfellows. Like some of the fundamental rules, the first day stuff you'll be taught in both arts, contradict each other. Like, in a very basic sense, boxing is hands up, chin down, and wrestling is hands down, chin up. And so, like, it is really about just being able to find the compromise between your two arts, both of them being trained at a high level, of course, being a necessary a necessary aspect as well. So, all right. Well, thank you, Chris. Thank you for that question, man. That was a very interesting one. Our next question comes to us from Lucas, also on Patreon, of course. And Lucas asks, Pat mentioned last week, Pat mentioned recently that he hopes Frankie Edgar will become a coach after he retires. What other fighters do you think would be great coaches after their retirements, and why?
Well, so I think there's kind of a sweet spot in terms of the meeting point between technical skill, the need to do it, the need to become a coach to kind of make a living in your chosen field afterwards, and kind of general understanding of the game. So just to be a really good fighter does not necessarily make you a great coach, because they're different skill sets.
Sure.
To analyze something and to analyze something is not the same skill set as to teach it. To teach it is not the same skill set as to analyze it, is not the same skill set as to do it yourself.
Yeah.
There is some overlap between those, but they are not necessarily the same thing at all. So fighters turned coaches, there are a lot of really excellent coaches who were not outstanding fighters. Rafael Cordeiro was a pretty decent fighter. Mike Brown was a really pretty dang good fighter for a very brief period of time. But like Firas Zahabi has never had a pro fight. Greg Jackson has never had an official pro fight. Brandon Gibson has had, I think, kickboxing and boxing matches, but has never had an MMA fight. Henry Hooft was a pretty good kickboxer.
Dwayne Ludwig was pretty good.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's kind of a mixed bag, but generally speaking, they're not the cream of the crop.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think like Mark Delagrati's been around for a long time, but I don't think he was ever like an outstanding fighter. I think he had fights, but was not like an outstanding one. So there's kind of a sweet spot there where like guys who go into coaching generally do it because they need to, and because they have not made enough money in the rest of their careers to go on and do something entirely different. Yeah. But they also tend to have an extremely high level of technical knowledge. So other current fighters that I think would be really good at it, I think Beneil Dariush would be a really good coach. I think he's a smart dude who understands how all the pieces fit together. Like, you ever look at that dude and think, this is not the right game plan?
No, never. Literally never.
Yeah, I mean, I think he would be right at the top of my list. I think GSP, if he wanted to or needed to, would be a pretty dang good coach, but I don't think he's ever going to want or need to.
Yeah, I think GSP stands out. So does Beneil Dariush, but I think another quality that probably plays a significant factor, and boy, if we were more professional, we might have run this against some actual data. So if somebody does know, if somebody can look into this, let us know. I'd be very interested to find out. But like professionalism in a fighter is a thing that I think you look for. Somebody who really takes the game seriously, who is always in shape, who doesn't miss weight, who doesn't overlook opponents, like
Jeremy Stevens knows a lot about fighting, but I would never peg Jeremy Stevens as like an obvious, boy, he'd be a great coach, because I know that sometimes he just doesn't seem to really care. And that is not something you can get away with as a coach. You have to be like very dedicated. And especially when like all the disappointments that deject fighters and harm their egos, like coaches put up with all of that too. So they have to be able to put up with it. They have to be able to put up with having like half a dozen guys who get so bummed out because they lost, they don't show up to training for a week. And it feels like a fuck you because their fighters aren't showing up for them, even though they're showing up for their fighters. And like, there's a lot of just sticking to your guns and staying with it that certain fighters exhibit. We've mentioned this in regards to like Rafael dos Anjos, who I think would probably make for a good coach just because he seems extremely dedicated and would always be there and always working to make concrete improvements. He thinks about the game in that way and treats it like a damn job.
Dominic Cruz,
absolutely.
I think is the quintessential example.
Absolutely.
Daniel Cormier, because Cormier has been coaching
for sure
for years and years and years and years. Cormier has coached. Like, I'm trying to think who else would fall into that category. By that same token, I don't know that you would point to like Henry Cejudo and think that guy's got what it takes to be an outstanding coach.
Cejudo strikes me very distinctly as the guy who is a phenomenally talented fighter and would probably be a pretty poor coach, actually. I mean, this is a lot of just sort of guesswork from the outside, but just based on the things that I think it takes to be a consistently high-level coach. I think those really professional, hardworking dudes really fit the bill. And that's why you have the combination of like an analytical mindset, constant, ceaseless improvement, even post-prime, and a very professional approach to the game. That also defines Frankie Edgar, which is the guy who, inspired the question.
This discussion in the first place. Yeah. Like I think Jim Miller would be a really good coach. And Miller has been doing some coaching, hasn't he?
I'm sure he has. Yeah. And Jim is, a very analytically minded guy, loves like P's and Q's. He really likes the finer points of training and really focuses on having clean technique. I know that's a big focus of his, and is, extremely professional and has just been a damn worker for his entire career. So those are the guys, I think. And I think that is one of those real separating factors, is just that, I don't know, what is the skill that makes you an elite fighter that specifically doesn't allow you to be a great coach? Is maybe just like that fighters don't think about tomorrow as a rule, and great fighters think about tomorrow less even than good fighters, and coaches have to think about tomorrow constantly? Is that part of it?
I think it's that for the truly great fighters, a lot of stuff comes easily. I think that, and great athletes in general, and maybe even great anythings. A lot of like, when you succeed at the most elite possible level, a lot of it you can just do it.
Yeah.
Like, for example, if you're a really incredibly gifted writer, right? Like there's just practice that goes into being a really good writer. You have to hone skills. There are technical skills to learn to become a good writer. But there's also a kind of a transcendent thing that some people just have when it comes to that you can't really teach, and it makes learning those technical skills a kind of an easier adjunct to it. So could the greatest possible writer teach writing as well as somebody who's had to grind it out to learn all of the technical aspects that go into becoming a good or a great writer? I don't know. I think a lot of it has to do with just how easy does it come. Like, because we've interviewed Demetrius Johnson. I've talked to Demetrius Johnson a number of other times besides that. Like, I think if he really wanted to, Demetrius Johnson could probably explain how and why he does the things that he does, but he doesn't want to.
Yeah.
It's not fun
it's not interesting.
Fun for him.
Yeah. It works because it works. It's not interesting how or why.
Yeah. Like he's just like, which is kind of interesting considering how incredibly good he is, that like, maybe he could, but it's not a thing that he really enjoys spending his time doing, which is why you would think that somebody who has the breadth and depth of skill that he has would be an awesome coach. I'm not sure that he would be, Maybe though, because DJ kind of reminds me a little bit in like in an aggregate way, in a big picture way, of Roy Jones.
And Roy Jones is like that exception to the rule where he was exceedingly professional to the point where he was always in shape and still taking fights very seriously until literally like last week. That was his retirement at like 49. Has been fighting for ages, has never been out of shape. I don't know that Roy Jones has ever missed weight or anything like that. I don't know that he's ever overlooked an opponent notably. And yet he is a guy who things were really easy for him. But he has, so far in a short tenure as a coach, I think had some really good results. He seems to be a great cornerman and seems to understand the fight game really well.
But Roy likes talking game.
Yeah, he is a professional analyst.
He likes talking about that.
Yeah.
And I don't know that Demetrius Johnson really does in quite the same way.
True.
Whereas Dominic, that's why I draw the contrast between DJ and Dominic Cruz, because Cruz loves talking game.
Cruz loves
Absolutely
to talk.
Loves it. Like interviewing Cruz on this show was one of the great pleasures of our career doing Heavy Hands, because he thinks so deeply about all of it.
Yeah.
You know?
And like, ceaselessly is just always thinking about the game.
Yeah, always thinking about his reads. Everything is a read to him. How do reads function? What is the epistemology of a read for him? Is something like Cruz has thought about issues like that, you know?
Demetrius Johnson is also always thinking about the game. It's just that in his case, the game is Dark Souls 2.
Yeah.
Sure. So that's the difference really between him and someone like him and Cruz.
It's interesting. I love thinking about stuff like this. This is one of the most interesting aspects of MMA for me, is how guys approach what is an objectively deeply complex and difficult sport at the highest levels, and how does that translate into other skill sets?
Yeah, which makes it a really good question. And thank you, Lucas, for asking it. And again, if you want your questions answered on the show, hit us up on our Patreon, the $5 level, and make sure you send them in if you haven't sent one in a while. Otherwise, I think that's about it. If that's about it for us, as I make my grandest flub of the episode so far. Pat, before we wrap up, what do you have that people should have their eyes out for this week?
I have an interview coming out on Tides of History with my dear friend, Dr. Keith Plymers, talking about environmental history, how climate, how rivers, forests, landscapes change over time, how humans are involved in that, and how that affects humans. I think it's a great interview. He's a dear friend of mine, and a great talker. I think you'll enjoy what he has to say.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I think that's about all I'm doing this week. I may be writing something history related, or I may not be. It's kind of hard to say.
Such is the wild life of a historian. Man, isn't it just never know, hand to mouth, one day to the next. As for me, I think I should tell you to check out the piece that I published this weekend. I know it was a full week, literally to the day after UFC 221, but I did put out a quite substantial breakdown of Romero Rockhold called How Yoel Romero Outsmarted Luke Rockhold, where I looked at some of the improvements that Rockhold made and the overall strategy of Romero that I think was key to him winning that fight. Pretty pleased with it. So if you have time to read like 3,500 words of analysis, go check that out on Bloody Elbow. And then this week, I am going to be looking at another installment in my new series, Undercard Stories, where I'm trying to focus on some of the narratives that I think the UFC should be telling among the undercards of their events. And this week, I'm going to focus that on Eric Shelton, who I think is a very promising flyweight that both Pat and I have lauded a few times on this show, and whose career I am continually invested in. So I think he is someone to watch. So make sure you look out for that as well. Otherwise, we will hit you guys next week. What's our next card coming up?
The massacre of a cyborg Yana Kunitskaya main event. But Edgar Ortega.
Let us keep that in mind and hold it close to our hearts for hope. And until then, we hope all of you enjoyed today's show. Make sure you find us on social media, questions, comments, concerns, whatever. You can find us both on Twitter. Pat is at Patrick_Wyman, and you can find me at Boxing Bush. That's BUSCH. You can also find both of us on Facebook, facebook.com/either Patrick Wyman MMA or Connor Ruebusch MMA. Check out our work at our various outlets, bloodyelbow.com for me mostly these days, and Pat, of course, over on Deadspin. Make sure you check out Tides of History as well, and we'll catch you guys next week. If you came here today for the finer points of face punching, you came to the right place. This has been Heavy Hands.